Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Monroe-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Rob Gardner will be speaking about drought proofing. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation, either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. And we have a great lineup of speakers scheduled. Join us on January 14th for a presentation by University of Regina Master's candidate Shayna Hamilton on her research with Prussian carp. And you don't want to miss our February 10th webinar by Laurel Berkeley with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. She will be speaking about greater sage grouse in Montana. You can register for these webinars through the PCAP website. All past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be uploaded there in the near future. I would also like to mention that the second Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference will be taking place next week. This event will include 2 week-long series of webinars about wetlands and agricultural drainage. It is hosted by Citizens Environmental Alliance and their partners, and you can find more information on the PCAP website or on our Facebook. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors: Eco-Friendly Sask, Pembina Pipelines, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Camp Wolfwillow, Ranchers Stewardship Alliance Inc., as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. And a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. We have over 150 people registered today, so everyone will be muted, but feel free to type it into the question section, or the chat would work too. If you're on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and all questions will be answered at the end. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Rob Gardner has landowners and urban conservationists share many values. Rob Gardner has come to this realization while exploring many sites across the northern Great Plains on foot and by canoe. He has visited ranchers and their lands from the Nebraska Sandhills to Alberta's parklands. He and his wife have lived in Medicine Hat for more than 35 years, where they enjoy vegetable gardening and canoeing. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to you, Rob.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. It's great to be here, and I'm pleased to have such a good audience. So I've been involved in the grassland conservation movement for many years, and yet it's just in the last few that I've really noticed some changes that I think are interesting. So if I can go into the program here. Am I getting?
I don't see your screen yet. Do you want me to send it to you again?
Oh. Is that better now?
Yes. And then if you just hit the play there.
So there we are. Can you see everything all right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so drought proofing. Droughts are more common all the time, and at least my impression is, and I would think most ranchers are trying to do something about that. And this program is oriented towards southeastern Alberta, but it's very similar in southwestern Saskatchewan. It's pretty dry country. I think people would agree on that. And over the last century or century and a half that ranching has been taking place in this area, the way that people are managing the land has really changed. People have realized what the challenges are more accurately and are taking steps to deal with them in a productive sort of a way. There's a formal way to do that called a range health assessment that some ranchers will use and other land managers, and it enables people to identify the challenges and at the same time find appropriate solutions for their land. Some people are less academic, and they're taking a shortcut and saying take half the grass and leave half the grass. But either way, you end up with a pretty healthy pasture with a good mix of grasses there. Now, how the streams are managed can also have a big effect on the ranch's viability. Most people don't realize that streams can be managed, and they just assume that what they've got there is what they're always going to have. And yet, if you go back and if ranchers talk to their parents or their grandparents, if that's possible, they might find that there used to be more water in the stream and that the stream ran for longer. So I think people need to recognize that there are things that can be done. A lot of streams look like this. And I'll admit, when I first saw this stream, when I took this photograph, I thought it looked pretty good. But unfortunately, that says more about how bad all the rest of the streams I'd seen were. This one still had water in it, at least in midsummer, but it can go a long way. It can get a lot better than that. I think everybody has seen healthy streams with lots of shrubbery, a few trees in them, and it is possible to do this in our environment. The streams are willing to help your operation, but they need some support. It's hard to believe that a well-managed creek like this can have more grazing in the very narrow riparian zone than the whole rest of the quarter section that it passes through. So it's worthwhile from a grazing perspective, but it also has many other values as well. I just have a graphic here that I hope people can use to kind of keep track of where we're at in the discussion. I'm starting from the goal that I think most ranchers have, that they'd like to have a few more cattle on their pasture, a few more range managers or profit centers, depending on your perspective. Most ranches in the Canadian prairies here are limited by water. There aren't very many sources of water. It's often seasonal. The water tends to be in one area, and the cattle crowd around there, leaving the rest of the pasture unused. Sometimes there's marginal quality. Cattle actually have a sense of taste, and they care what kind of water they're drinking, and they don't drink an optimal amount of water if it doesn't taste good. It means too salty generally or brackish. And so they do crowd around the riparian area, wherever the water is. They'll spend a lot of time loafing around, and you can imagine what else they're doing in the water. So change is possible. Let's keep that in mind as we go through some photographs of what we can be doing. And I emphasize the photographs. I think a lot of people talk and write books and papers, but I think photographs have a real impact. So I hope you'll agree here. When it comes to managing streams, like anything else, the manager is in the driver's seat. They're deciding what they should be doing and how they're going to do it. And I've found that there's kind of two types of land manager. There's people that really want to do something that's going to work. They want something that's been tried and true, and everybody knows how to do it. And then there's people that are a little bit more of a renegade, perhaps. They want to create their own solution. They like the challenge of doing something that's not proven, and they're willing to take some of the risks if it doesn't work out quite the way they were hoping. So let's take a closer look at some of the options that are available to each of these types of manager. Here are the tried and true type. These are activities that have been shown across North America to really help improve the health of streams and improve the grazing there. The first is riparian health assessment, but we'll take a closer look at each of these in a second. There's rest rotation grazing, which is rapidly gaining ground. Off-stream watering is valuable. Luring cattle away from the stream with either the supplements or minerals, and herding them. Herding has kind of fallen out of favor in the last few years people don't have horses as much as they used to. But as a city person, I always thought that must be the high point of the whole career, is getting to ride horses all day. So these are all methods that have a pretty well documented payback. The Cows and Fish Organization in Alberta has produced this riparian health assessment, and you can download this online, and it's totally applicable for southwestern Saskatchewan as well. And it's based on a self-administered quiz that you give your stream. You ask it questions and give it a score depending on how well the stream answers the questions. So without getting into too much detail, I'll just point out that of these 11 questions, 5 of them are directly oriented towards stream trees and shrubs and their presence there and how they're doing. So without shrubs, it's pretty tough to get a good score. Your stream just isn't very healthy if it doesn't have shrubs. So that's a pretty healthy stream there with a good selection of shrubs growing there in the riparian area. Now there's another important one that people may skip over. It's incitement. Is your stream on the same level as its floodplain? Is it able to go over its banks at least every couple of years? Or is it confined to a narrow channel? That here's a typical incised or downcut stream in southern Alberta. And you can see it's fairly stable. There isn't much erosion happening, but it's not watering the floodplain, which you can see is probably a quarter mile wide there. All those sagebrush used to be able to reach the water table, but now they're being stressed. So there's a lot of grazing that could be happening on that quarter mile wide, formerly riparian area, but the down cutting has happened. I mentioned herding. You can use salt or other methods to get cattle to move out to the far corners of the pasture. And sometimes, even quite often, once they realize how good the grass is in the far corner, they'll take the effort to get back there. And it certainly spreads out the use of your land. Off-stream watering is tremendously valuable. In fact, a number of sources say it can increase the beef production on a pasture by 10%. That's a combination of the cattle drinking more water because it tastes good, because they haven't been watering in the ponds, fertilizing them with their poop. And the second reason is that they stay healthier. They've got the good footing up there. You can see it's pretty well used. And they don't get foot rot, they don't get scours. It only takes one calf dying of scours to really cut into the bottom line. Incidentally, in the bottom right corner of the picture, you'll see the blue float out in the middle of the dugout. And just pumping the water that short distance keeps the cattle out of the mud, and it keeps the water cleaner and improves your bottom line. Now here's a few ideas that are not widely used, but do have potential. Other people have used them and found they work well. So you can give this a try. You can actually plant shrubs, especially willows, along the shoreline of your streams. You can fence the riparian areas, not to keep the cattle out, but so you can manage them better. There's some structures you can build in the stream if you work with your Department of Environment, whoever your land agency is. And taking stuff out of the floodplain reduces everybody's blood pressure a little bit. But they do take a little while to show results and to have a payback. Planting shrubs is pretty, well, it's hard work, but it's pretty easy conceptually. There are a few tricks you can do, and basically you have to have fairly thick stems, about the diameter of your thumb and 1/2 meter long. A stupid stick can actually tell when it's right side up and when it's upside down, and it grows better if it's right side up. So try to keep track of which end used to have the leaves on it. and cattle will get in there and devour your new willows if they get a chance. So try to put an electric fence around it. If you're using rest rotation grazing, maybe plant your willows in the field that's being rested that year and rotate it through your operation that way. Watering trees that you've planted can be a real time sink. It takes a lot of effort. If you plant the willows closer to the stream, they'll grow better and in a more natural situation. So look for areas where soil is accumulating, and that demonstrates that they won't be carried away by the next flood. This is a place where soil is gathering, and it'll stay moist pretty much all summer. The fencing changes. The cattle or the grazing capacity, I guess, depends on the vegetation, not on the number of the quarter section that you're working on. So instead of fencing on survey lines, if you can adjust fences to match the ecological zones, especially so the riparian area is separate from the big fields. And you can still graze the riparian area, but for a limited amount of time and at a controlled time. So the cattle will be in there and they'll get the grazing value, then they'll be out again. You can still have access for water when they're using the rest of the field. This is the first of the structures that are fairly easy to add to a stream and don't have negative impacts on other wildlife. This is a view looking down on a narrow stream that's down cut, and people would like to slow down the flow a little bit. So just taking a couple of aspens from a nearby grove, dropping them in the channel will cause the silt and other vegetation to accumulate, get a bit of a pool, and slow down the flow. I should mention that the credit here, Zedek and Cloutier, are two folks in New Mexico that have pioneered this approach. They have an excellent book that's available, very down to earth and amazing changes that they've documented from using some of these things. In this case, they're driving in a series of short fence posts, untreated, but this line of them points upstream, which might be counterintuitive. They're actually providing a space that's marked 20 degrees there, where the sediment accumulates because there's no flow, and then the current is pressed against the other bank, and it does cause some erosion there. And that's a hard concept to get your people's head around, that the erosion is not a bad thing in itself. The bad thing is not having a place to deposit the stuff that's taken out. And so by providing a series of these veins, there's always a place for the sediment to be deposited. And the end result is a more meandering stream that moves slower, has accumulating areas where it's easy for willows to get started. This is the next step up from that, a stream catcher, and it's a man-made leaky dam. You can pound some posts in with a pneumatic post pounder and weave some willows or other brush in amongst them. This is a very tidy one, but you can actually drag small trees in and anchor them with the odd fence post. And it just slows everything down, and which gives the silt a space to accumulate and keep it from clogging up downstream. Flood plain. What part of this don't people understand? I guess when these buildings were first built, people didn't have much of a history of how high the stream could get, but clearly it gets too high. This fellow has an irrigation pump pretty close to the water, and that's something valuable he doesn't want to lose. Use the opportunity between floods to move things back whenever you have a chance. Give the stream a little more room to move, and I think everybody will be able to relax a little bit when high water does come. We know it's going to be coming eventually. So where are we on our action plan here? we've got a few options we can be accumulating. We can give it a try. We can be training the cattle. We can be luring them with the salt. We can take the water out of the stream or the dugout and put it into a trough where it's easier to get. We can install some devices in cooperation with the local land and water agency, and we can rest pastures and keep the cattle back from the riparian area, and even plant some willows. So, and what happens if we do that? Overall, we get a more even forage use. We get better drought resistance because the streams are in better condition. There's more little pools storing water. There's less erosion during the floods, less disease in the cattle, and better weight gain all the way around. So, don't want to make promises. It all depends on how it's implemented, but overall, it's pretty likely that you're going to get a higher stocking rate. So here's a stream that's improving, and you can see that a lot of patches, the little pinkish patches close to the stream are young groves of willows. I've highlighted a few of them here. You can see that this is on the way to rejuvenation. So after a few years, you're going to end up with a healthier stream. The water is higher quality, flows for a longer time. Both the upland and the riparian carrying capacity will increase, and you'll start seeing beaver colonizing the stream for even more water conservation. And this will lead to your goal of more cattle on the pasture. Now, not to dwell entirely on beef production, I know ranchers really value their role as a steward of the landscape, and I think this is a sort of a stream that ranchers can point to with pride when they're showing their city relatives around, perhaps, and recognize that this is a landscape that's being well taken care of. You may have noticed I mentioned the beaver there, not at the start. Beaver need, or prefer at least, a stream with a certain level of health before they can move in. But you can't get a stream that's this healthy without beaver. They've made many small dams and spread the water out across this whole valley. So this is an ultimate goal. What's the best thing about beaver? They store all kinds of water, and they work for free, no maintenance costs. For people that are living south of the divide in extreme southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, you might appreciate that beaver are actually dual citizens, and as such, they don't need water licenses to store water. Whereas if a rancher tries to dig dugouts or create check dams, they can get into trouble or at least go through a lot of red tape to get it done. Beaver do create more habitat than they eat. If you got a favorite tree there, you can wrap it with some substantial wire and protect it. But you can know that overall beaver will be creating habitat. Their dams aren't all that big, so if any individual dam fails, it's not a big deal. And it comes right down to it, beavers are rodents, not a long-term commitment. So I know we've all heard stories about the challenges that beavers can create, and most of those stories come from the parkland region and farther north, where there's more development and less space for the beaver. But you don't have to keep the beaver to keep the benefits. A dam will last for a number of years. So I'm amazed at people who try to blow up dams or remove them with a backhoe. Really, the dam is the valuable part, so keep that at least. I think that's a nice looking stream. And look at all the dams there. Beaver can create a tremendous number of dams, and each one holds more water. The fact that they leak is surprisingly is maybe the most important aspect of dams. They're strong enough to hold the water after a thunderstorm, but the minute after the thunderstorm is finished, the water starts draining out of it. So even by the next day, they've got a bit of capacity to hold some more of that water back. And the water that goes through the dam isn't wasted because it's flowing into the next little pond. So in a mature beaver system, you'll have hundreds of dams and all gradually go down in level, but they'll never get totally empty because there's always a hole the beaver have excavated that will always have water in a drought. This shows the dam being partially full, but still room to hold some more. Here's a whole chain of dams going down this very short valley. That's the end of it up there. It's only 1 kilometer or so long, but has half a dozen dams in it. The water beside the dam, beside the pond, is soaked into the ground, and then as the water level goes down, it gradually soaks out back into the stream. So it's part of the reservoir, and that keeps streams like this flowing pretty much all summer. This is from north central Montana, and there's really a very short beaver dam, and it's pushed water and the water table right across this large valley bottom. And on the near side, you can see the large patches of willows that are growing very well. And in behind, there's excellent growth of sagebrush. Sagebrush is the riparian species. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, at least, it needs more water than it gets through rain and snow. So it makes use of the groundwater. Now, if we just turn our view 90 degrees to the right and look downstream, this is the very same location. And you'll see the trees, the only trees for many miles, are growing up in the channel where it gets a dependable flow of water. But the riparian area overall is not as healthy. And if you look at the sagebrush, it's suffering because the water table is not as high as it is above the dam. So overall, after taking these measures, the shrubby vegetation does increase, and it just means that the stream is getting healthier. Here's an example of a valley with trees and shrubs and a lot of beaver. It's still doing pretty well. Now, I know some of you are saying, wow, that looks terrific. I sure wish I could get some beaver, but how am I going to do it? I don't have any trees out there. Beaver would never survive. Is that right? Is that what you're thinking? I hope so. Well, let's look at some other examples of extreme beaver habitat. Not what most people think of. But let's take a closer look at that little strip of green down the bottom there. It's a giant bed of cattails, and all created by beaver in a dry environment. You can see the channel they've worn in there. Another example, no willows or other shrubs for miles here, and yet they've got many big dams made up of nothing but cattail leaves plastered together with mud. So beaver really can be living anywhere, although they'd rather live in places that had some shrubs. Beaver have been a very big part of our prairies, but we've forgotten. If you look through the trapping records from the early 1800s, thousands of beaver skins were taken out of the prairies, places where people haven't seen beavers for many, many years. But they were common right across our prairie. So we can still see some signs of it if we look carefully. I think people would agree that this is a modern beaver dam, even without seeing the stump in the top left there with the wood chips scattered around it. Well, if we look at the same location 4 months later, exactly the same dam after 4 months of high water, it's washed away some of the loose stuff, but the foundation of it is still there. It's still holding back water and creating a bit of a riffle there. Then if we go to a different location, we find what I think is a very similar looking ridge going across the stream. And I believe that used to be a beaver dam, perhaps at least 20, perhaps 50 years ago. And close by, there's another dam, more substantial, that's been breached, but still holding back a bit of water. You can see in the back the larger willows that haven't reproduced very much lately. They're being browsed into a mushroom shape. So beavers, like other natural forces, go through a cycle. Let's take a closer look at what different phases of that cycle look like, and maybe we can start watching for them on our own land. First step is the beaver arrive from somewhere else, and they think it looks not too bad, or maybe they're just plain hungry. They start chewing off the shrubs and perhaps trees and make a dam and a lodge. The dam raises the water table, obviously, encourages the shrubs to grow better, and as well as other forages. As the dam gets taller, water pushes out into the floodplain, and you get a much larger riparian area with a lot more water storage, a lot more stability. When the dams reach the side of the valley, that's actually a weak point in the dam. They can't attach the dam very well to the valley itself, and so there tends to be more leakage on the edges, and you can get slumping happening here, which broadens the valley as well. Eventually, though, the ponds will silt up. There's not enough room, and they leave. Before too long, the pond will drain. Too long being 2, 3, 5 years, not on the first season or two. But this is a drained pond that shows the amount of silt that's been captured and stored there, and it's significantly changed the shape of the valley. It's building up that valley, and with soft sediment that holds water well, and very fertile. Here's the pond after a few years. It's vegetated. It's excellent grazing at this stage, and just a good thing there. A few years later, the shrubs have actually spread through the higher parts of the valley, which means along the dams mostly, and created a lot more shrubs, a lot more food, the beaver would be saying. So there is lots of beaver-chewed sticks embedded in these lines of shrubs. A little hard to show in the photograph. So with all that, the site's starting to look pretty good for beaver again, and so they move back in, but to have a better starting point because that fertile silt is accumulated. There's a broader area of shrubs for them, and they'll be able to last longer. This cycle, even at once a century, that means it could have happened 100 times since the glaciers left. It's probably happened way more than that. That's lots of time to make significant changes to the landscape. So as you go through the cycle after cycle of gradual improvement over the centuries, the streams have become healthier and end up running year-round. So for me, it's not a big stretch to imagine that valley with those lines of snowberry and rose actually being lines of willow and dogwood across there, holding back the water. But beaver have been trapped out for 2 centuries, and the signs of them have disappeared largely. And they certainly weren't when our ancestors first came here to start ranching. They didn't recognize that this was actually a valley that had held beaver in it for many years. They thought it was dry, and really the conditions haven't changed much in the last 150 years. But when a beaver does move into the area, they'll be storing the water that your cattle can be using effectively. So what I'm trying to get across here is that beaver are a valuable but underrated tool that ranchers can be managing. There are simplistic solutions to beaver problems, but there are some more innovative ones and that allow the beaver to continue providing the benefits while also protecting the landscape from over-enthusiastic beaver. The pond leveler or beaver deceiver is the oldest one of these. There's a perforated pipe that's lowered into the pond and protected with a mesh fence. and that keeps the water at the maximum level and goes through the pipe to be deposited on the downhill side. So it doesn't matter how high the dam gets built, the water can still flow through at that level. So the beaver has enough water to survive, and he's not even very motivated to increase the dam, so he doesn't chew down all that much timber either. Now there's a more recent approach that's a lot simpler, maybe not quite as durable, but just making a fence around your culvert or other infrastructure that you want to protect is pretty cheap and easy. There's a website, the Mustakas Institute, which shows step-by-step how to make this, and there are some tricks to it. For example, the upstream side, it has to be wider than the downstream side of it. That way, when the sticks are piled up against the sides of that enclosure by the beaver, they tend to wash away rather than being pushed into it by the current. So, just by way of summary here, is this what we want our streams to look like on our landscape? There's water in it, yeah, but there's alkali, there's not much else. Or does this stream look better? I'm not a rancher, but I think this looks like a healthier stream that I would think ranchers would want to aspire to. Now, the interesting thing here is that these are the same stream. They're less than a kilometer apart. That management really does make a difference. You can have an impact on your landscape if you take the initiative. So I believe most ranchers and most ranches could have a lot more water on them and have a lot more cattle grazing on them. And we're just looking for people to take the challenge, to make a bit of effort and perhaps change a few ideas and take the plunge, so to speak, into the beaver business and give that a try. So if you're interested in more details, there's more information available that I can give in a short presentation like this. But you can give me a call, an email, and I'd be glad to help you out. So thank you very much for your attendance. And I think Caitlin will be having some questions here.
Yes, first off, thank you very much, Rob. That was a really, really interesting presentation and very thought-provoking, and a number of participants have written in to say thank you, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for catching our webinar today. If you have any questions, feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard, or if you're on the phone, send a chat to the organizer. Either way, I'll get it and I can read your question. There is a question here from a listener named Ross about can beavers be reintroduced into grassland systems with limited or no trees? Have you seen successes that way?
Yes, I have, and they can be, although it's more challenging. And so the best way is to start out with the vegetation and give the vegetation a head start by planting willows and creating some of those stream catchers that I mentioned there. And that will get a start, so when the beaver are reintroduced, they're more comfortable and less likely to leave immediately.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named May would like to know, is beaver dam water healthy for cows to drink?
Well, I think so. A lot of cattle are drinking it. I guess that it's the same water that they've been drinking out of the stream for 100 years. The only difference is that it's been slowed down, so the silt has a chance to settle out. And silt is the main method that germs have of being carried around. Most bacteria are attached to silt particles. When they settle out, your water is, this final picture shows, is pretty clean.
And are there concerns about beaver fever?
Well, I've actually had beaver fever, but I got it from cattle, from drinking out of a mucky stream. So it's not much fun to have, and I'm sensitive to that. But no, beaver fever is not common in the drier parts of our landscape, and I don't believe that's a significant concern.
Thanks for that answer. One of our listeners is wondering if you can go back to the slide with the stream catchers. And I'd just like to let everyone know that you can take a screenshot too at any time. If you are not in full screen mode, there's a screenshot like camera that appears, and you can click that, and then it'll save the picture of the slide to the desktop, which is really handy.
Where did our stream catchers go? There we are.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
And I don't think there was a question there, but we can just leave it there for a few minutes if that's okay. One of
Sure.
our listeners named Krista said there's quite a few areas in southern Saskatchewan that have offered bounties on beavers in the past. Do you think our RMs and provincial government are receptive to your message that beavers are good?
Well, not being a Saskatchewan resident, I think the RM councils are very receptive to the opinions of their landowners, of their constituents. And if people complain about beaver, they'll try to do something about it. I didn't get into all the control techniques or management approaches, but if you had a culvert you were concerned about getting clogged by beaver, if you put a stream catcher like this immediately above the culvert, like 10 meters above, and the beaver will build the dam on that, and there'll be no motivation to build the dam in the culvert itself. So that's another trick that people can do. But yes, I think, I hope some of the RM councils are on this call, and if they aren't, I hope you could refer them to the website that will have it as a presentation. You can look at it anytime, and just give it a bit of a thought. And I guess I'm hoping people make up their own minds and just not go with what people from other regions have found can be a problem.
Mm-hmm. One of our listeners is wondering what stream management techniques would you use to improve or encourage sagebrush health?
Well, sagebrush is important, and in the United States, where they have a big push to keep sage-grouse from being listed as endangered, they've made thousands of these stream catchers, tens of thousands probably. They have 1,800 ranchers that are signed up with over 7 million acres of land that they own or manage altogether that are doing these things specifically because they improve habitat for sage-grouse. First of all, they raise the water table and give the sagebrush better access to water through the roots. But second of all, the perimeters of all these small ponds have a lot of wildflowers growing in them. Some people might call them weeds, but baby sage-grouse calls them breakfast. Things like even dandelions and sow thistle, but also all the native plants, whether are all excellent food for baby sage-grouse in that critical 2-week to 2-month period of growth. So you can look up sage-grouse initiative, SGI, and then they'll have a lot of information on how to make these and who's doing it.
Awesome, that's great. That's a great resource too. Thanks for sharing that. A listener named Jessica would like to know if you have any thoughts on vegetation differences across the prairie. What she means is, would shrubs be seen across the prairie to the degree your pictures show? Are there areas where streams just wouldn't have as much shrub coverage?
Well, my position here is, after looking carefully at many, many streams in extremely dry conditions, that beaver can survive and they can create wooded riparian areas in virtually any habitat in North America. And I say that because an acquaintance of mine sent me photographs of beaver dams in the middle of the Mojave Desert, not far from Los Angeles, and clearly visible on Google Earth. And I've personally seen a whole chain of beaver dams in absolute badland condition just west of Drumheller. So given a chance and given an opportunity to get introduced, the shrubs will grow there along any of our streams. The challenge is that cattle are a forest species, and that they actually prefer eating willows to eating grass, so that if you have any willow at all showing up, they're going to browse it off. I've had several ranchers tell me that when they're resting their field, the willows will start popping up along the creek. When they put the cattle back in, the willows disappear.
We actually have a question about willows. It might be perfect timing. A listener named Graham would like to know, when getting willows for planting, should they be sourced from local neighboring locations? Should collectors focus on specific species of willow? And he notes that understanding that species ID of willow can be challenging.
Well, yeah, willow ID is extremely challenging. There's many species and they're very hard to tell apart. And so definitely just going upstream or downstream or to your next door neighbor's ranch and harvesting them there close to the site is the best way to do it. And you can do that anytime in the winter when they're not in leaf, and then store them in a snowbank where they stay well preserved, like being in a refrigerator. And then in the spring, when they start melting out of the snowdrift, good time to plant them. But yes, keep them local. Don't order them in from an outside location or whatever, and you shouldn't have any trouble there.
Okay, perfect. And so just to confirm, harvesting is best in the winter time, put them in a snowbank, and then wait till the spring to plant?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you. There's quite a few listeners that are writing in about the stream catchers and other structures that are put into a water body. Some listeners are concerned that there may be provincial laws and regulations that apply specifically in Alberta. Is this something that people should look into before they install? Do you have any insight on how to be successful in getting regulatory permits for stream catchers and veins?
Well, as I mentioned, yes, you should definitely talk to your Fish and Wildlife, or in Alberta, it's Alberta Environment that manages the streams, and work in cooperation with them. Now, there are many resources available now. A lot of research that's been done on the passage of fish going up and down through these and other impacts like that. And they've been shown to have very little impact on native fish. There has been some documentation that non-native trout have trouble passing through them, which is a good thing. You don't want the non-native trout moving around. The other aspect is that you can start creating these things at the very headwaters before it's a creek. Right up in the start of the coulee, a couple of straw bales placed across a little gully will start collecting silt that's washed off the adjacent cultivated fields, perhaps. And then you can extend these downhill gradually. And as you're making contact with the authorities and discussing it with them.
And do you have any comments about navigable water laws?
Well, yes, I'm a big believer in them. As a canoeist, I really don't want to see fences across the water, streams and rivers. At the same time, there are very small streams that would benefit from this sort of a thing. So I think there's lots of room for discussion, and there's lots of examples. Again, going back to the sage-grouse people in the U.S., but also in the Western United States. People are importing beaver and getting them started with a stream catcher like this, specifically to support their salmon populations. They've been beaver ponds have been shown to increase salmon productivity by, I think it's 2 to 8 times, just by having these small ponds, and small fish are able to go right through them.
Awesome. We have a few listeners who are interested in knowing more about beavers, in specific the reintroduction. Is there anyone that does that? Do you need permits? One listener says that there's lots in central Saskatchewan. um, yeah, how does one go about that?
Well, yeah, the first stop is your Fish and Wildlife Office, obviously. And in Alberta, beaver have kind of two designations. They're a pest that landowners can shoot, and they're a protected species that nobody else can shoot. They're a fur bearer, actually, and if they're under the trapping regulations, which means if you're not a trapper, you shouldn't be trapping them. And so it's kind of two different approaches that are contradictory. And this is new in Canada, so they don't have a protocol worked out right now. I wouldn't want to see beaver move long distances, but they're usually beaver quite close at hand that wouldn't be introducing new problems to your stream.
Mhm. Thanks for that answer. A listener named Earl would like to know how you suggest managing downstream owner issues if you're holding back water on your land.
Well, I guess that goes back to the leaky dam, that you're not holding it back permanently, you're just slowing it down. We didn't talk at all about irrigation, taking water out of the stream. It's just staying there for a little longer and then continuing on. Most downstream water users, I would think, would want to have a more dependable flow through their stream rather than a big rush in the spring and drying out by August. So I would approach the neighbors beforehand, obviously, but approach them with the idea that cooperatively they can install these structures or support the beaver if that's possible. And together they'll have a more dependable stream that's good for their cattle and good for the environment.
Thanks for that answer. One of our listeners has commented that apparently on CBC yesterday, they've reintroduced beavers in England, and apparently the European variety of beaver is more polite and not aggressive as ours. Have you heard about that? Do you have any comments?
Yes, actually, I have heard of it, and I've actually seen them. I was in Scotland a couple of years ago and saw an area where they were just being introduced a couple of years earlier. So there wasn't much impact, but a little. And I think that in Britain, I don't think the beaver are really much different. Genetically, they're different, but behaviorally, they're pretty much the same. But the first places they put them were not very good habitat, and mostly coniferous forest, and they weren't able to chew down very many trees. And they didn't need to because they were on extremely large lakes. That as they move into the streams, I think they're going to be chewing down about the same number of trees. And but again, they have done a lot of research because it's a totally new species to the country. You know, in the last 400 years, there hasn't been any beaver until the last decade, and so they've been very well studied, and there haven't been any negative impacts. They notice the streams are clearer. They don't have the floods and droughts that they used to have.
Thanks for that answer. I think that's all the questions that we have right now. I've had a number of participants type in that have said great images and very interesting presentation. And yeah, thank you for the fantastic presentation. And there's a listener named Anastasia who's commented that there's a book called Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter by Ben Goldfarb. So that's one I'll have to look up. Have you read that one, Rob?
Yes, that's an excellent book. There's also another one came out a year earlier by a Canadian author. It's called Once They Were Hats, and
Oh,
Canadian perspective.
yeah. Huh, good name.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess with that, I'll say thank you very much for the awesome presentation. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for catching our broadcast today. Stay tuned for our upcoming webinars and be sure to check out the agricultural drainage webinar series going on next week. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.